All right, welcome everyone to this meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont. Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started, we got a few announcements, a few things to go over. First thing I'm going to go over, we all know it, Jeff Cohen. What's going on with baseball and barbecue, my man? How you doing?
Thank you, Bruce. Yes, on baseball barbecue this week, we have Will Bardenwerper. He wrote a book called Homestand. It's about the minor league in Batavia, New York, the Batavia Muck Dogs that was eliminated, and now they have a wood-back college team. It could be about any town in America losing a minor league baseball team. So that's very interesting talk. And next week, I'm going to promote it now because I'll be out of the country, is Brett Moore. Now, if you haven't heard of Brett Moore, I urge you to listen to this one coming out on May 24th. He has a one-man show about baseball, and it is magnificent. So I urge everybody to tune in next week for Brett Moore on Baseball and BBQ on all your podcast apps.
I have not heard of Brett Moore before, so now I'm going to have to go look him up after tonight's meeting. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. If you're not listening to Baseball and Barbecue, I highly suggest you get on your podcatcher app after the meeting tonight and subscribe to that podcast. It's one of the best out there, so don't miss that. Now, next up, for those of us who are local, who's joining us in Nashua? We're going to have some fun. Friday, May 30th, the Nashua Silver Knights have invited us, and Joe Ross is going to be there. I'll get to him in just a minute. The Nashua Silver Knights have invited us in to watch them take on the Vermont Lake Monsters in Futures League action at, get this, 6:03 p.m. Gee, I wonder why they did that. And we're going to have a table there with stuff for the kids. We're going to have a book swap. We're going to have a membership drive. We're going to be able to talk with the fans about what SABR's all about. We're going to talk to them about Clyde Sukeforth. It's going to be a really fun evening, and I'm looking for people to stop by and have a good time with us. If you want to show up that night, email me directly. I'll get you on the list, and we'll have you in. We're going to meet at 5 o'clock out in the parking lot so that we can get set up. And while we're talking about set up, Joe Ross is here tonight. Joe has been furiously printing the kids' packets and things like that we're going to be handing out. And so if anybody is driving through Nashua and they can't get the sound of a printer printing out of their head, it's because Joe's printer is working overtime. And we appreciate him doing that. Mark Hoyle is hopefully going to be there. That will be fantastic. We'd love to have you down, Mark, so that'd be great. SABR 53. If you don't have travel plans for SABR 53, get to sabr.org, click the SABR 53 button, and take a look at what's going to be happening for that week. You're not going to want to miss it. There's so much fun. There's Hall of Famers that are going to be there. We're going to 2 ball games, pack night. I'm not going to sleep for like 5 days. It's going to be crazy talk. Molly shaking her head yes, because she knows. She texts me all throughout the day, and she's like, "Where's my?" Oh yeah, that's right. He's at a convention. Yeah. Throws the phone aside. Joe, what's going on?
Then he dares to try and call me at 10 o'clock at night to say good night and I love you, and I'm sound asleep.
Right.
I just wanted to tell you that the reason the game starts at 6:03 is because if they're on the radio, the broadcast starts at 6. You have to give them a minute to say hello. They all do that. Even major leagues do that.
That's true, but 6:03 is our area code, my man.
You should know that.
It's a professional act around here. Mark Hoyle in the chat. Pack night with the Chicago Clan is a fun time. It is a fun time. I've got my ammunition ready, man. I'm ready to go. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to happen Thursday night after the minor league game. So Friday, we're all going to be bleary eyed as we're trying to get started. Ben Abel, you're up. Go.
Well, if you're at a convention, Bruce, and you don't communicate with your wife and you call her at 10 o'clock at night, are you sober or are you drunk when you call her at 10 o'clock at night? My guess is you're not sober.
I don't
Bruce
drink.
does not drink.
Oh, that's true. He doesn't. That's right.
Yep.
Nope.
So
He just has too
I'm
much
just-
fun talking with friends and drinking soda.
I get pulled in so many different directions. Last year when I got to the convention, I didn't sit down and this was the day before. I didn't sit down for at least 7 hours. I was pulled in so many different directions. It's a time to, commune at the Church of Baseball, to see your friends, to see other SABR members, to talk about research and projects. And it is an amazing week of a baseball buffet that you will remember for the rest of your life. If you're not going or you're considering going, get to the website and take a look and get signed up today. All right. On to our feature presentation. Here we go. Tonight, we focus on a fascinating episode in 19th century baseball when the call to root out unsavory elements in the burgeoning professional game helped serve as fodder for salacious and unethical journalism bent on selling papers at any cost. In June 1886, the Cincinnati Enquirer ran a series of exposés accusing players on the Reds American Association team, led by Tony Mullane, of deliberately throwing games after tipping off gamblers through the scheme. Mullane, recognized as one of the best all-around ballplayers of the era and perhaps overdue for Hall of Fame consideration, had never before been implicated in any of the numerous gambling rumors and scandals of the day. This is a tale of invented evidence, anonymous witnesses, drunken and malicious accusations, and an attempt by outlaw leagues to capitalize on the scandal. Sadly, such stories were becoming more and more common as newspapers entered an era of yellow journalism where truth became secondary to sensationalism. Doug Krehbel is a historian and lifelong baseball fan based in Baltimore, just a quick walk from Camden Yards. He earned an MA in history from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, where his research focus was on the intersection between sport and state power in early modern Britain. He's an actor and a playwright and moonlights as a high school and Division III umpire in Maryland. Doug Krehbel, welcome to Northern New England. My friend, how are you this evening?
Thank you, Bruce. First of all, quick sound check. Anybody having trouble hearing?
You sound great.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And I got to tell you, this is a fun chapter. You guys, you guys are awesome. So again, thank you so much for letting me talk to you. I am competing with a Red Sox game, so I am going to be fast, loud, and funny. I promise you that. Well, maybe not the funny part, but no. This is a tale that I came across about a year ago that I really wanted to research into. Again, about me a little bit. I am a historian. I've been an APA player since 1978. If any of you are table gamers, SABR member. Pitched 1 year at Division III Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I did not pitch 2 years because they told me not to. So that's that. And this is actually some work that I presented at the Ivor conference in Cooperstown, which was a wonderful thrill in April. So I'm going to share my screen and. Awesome. Bruce, everybody able to see the title page?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right. Well, guys, cast your mind back to the end of the 19th century. It's been about 10 years since the formation of the National Association. Baseball is in good stead at this point. There's not been a lot of scandal. There's been some accusations of, paying players, which at that point everybody knows was pretty terrible. But this is a story of an incredibly talented, mercurial, charismatic, moody, greedy athlete, and the media that tried to take him down. One media outlet in particular. I bet that folks on this call, and I can't see your faces, so I don't know if anybody's nodding or not, but I bet a bunch of people on this call know who Tony Mullane is. But I bet if you went to Camden Yards right now or to any other baseball stadium and asked 100 random fans, they would probably give you a blank stare. But this is a story of two men. And the first man here is a man named John Roll McLean, born in Cincinnati in the mid-1900s. He was a big baseball fan. He was a stockholder of the American Association franchise in Cincinnati, which we'll be spending all of our time on today. He also became owner of the Union Association 1884 Outlaw Reds in Cincinnati. And he was also the owner of the Cincinnati Enquirer and later the Washington Post. Very, very rich man. We'll find out that he's a very bitter man. Find out he's a man who likes to hold a grudge. Not sure if that's has any resonance. And upon his death, he left an estate worth almost $750 million. Newspaperman, his father had owned the Cincinnati Enquirer before him. So he's one part of our story, but the main part of our story is Anthony John Mullane. He was born in 1859 in Cork in Ireland. His mother was a homemaker. His father was a laborer. They moved to Erie, Pennsylvania when Tony was 3. And he took a natural affinity to baseball, which, again, I don't want to tell people things that they know already. But as you know, about between 1870 and 1900, about a third to a quarter of baseball players were Irish born, not just Irish American born, but born in Ireland. John Evers, probably the most famous. 284 wins, 5 straight 30-win seasons. There's only 3 pitchers with more wins that are not in the Hall of Fame. And I can't see folks here. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm gonna try and look at the chat. Can anyone tell me who the 3 pitchers are that have more than 284 wins that are not in the Hall of Fame? Tommy John, I see. Yes. Not Jamie Moyer. Sorry.
Roger Clemens.
Roger Clemens. The third one's the toughest. All right. Well, I won't hold it up, but I will say that. No, he's short of that. Bobby Matthews was a 19th century pitcher as well, who crossed over into the 20th century. That was the third as of this point. I think Bartolo is going to come back. I think he might win another 16 games or so. Mullane, obviously talented. He was ambidextrous. He was known as maybe the first ambidextrous pitcher. And here's Mullane's Apicard from 1883, and a very handsome gentleman. Mullane said, "I was an ambidextrous pitcher," he told the Washington Post in 1899. He said, "but as a rule, I never called on my left hand unless we were playing an exhibition game and practice for the amusement of a few friends." The Enquirer would later call him the gay and festive count, the Apollo of the mound, never indulged in intoxicating liquors, never used tobacco, a very handsome fellow and a general favorite of the ladies. Mullane was a groundbreaker, though, in another way, in that he thought that he deserved the highest salary possible. In an era that lasted all the way up until maybe the 1980s, he was one of the first to say, "You've offered me a contract, but it's not good enough. I'm going to jump to another club." Unfortunately, that cast against him because it called into question his so-called loyalty. He tried to jump leagues a couple of times. We'll talk about that in a few minutes when we get to 1885. But he was successful. He was incredibly successful. He went 35-15 with St. Louis one year. The next year he jumped to Toledo and won 35 more games. And interestingly enough, in that Toledo club, the only other good pitcher was future umpire Hank O'Day. He had a reputation, though. He had a reputation going against him. And the Times-Star in Cincinnati, when he arrived in 1886, said, "If Mullane was going to sue all the papers that called him a traitor, he has a tremendous task on his hands." He was a mean pitcher. He threw at so many hitters that it's generally considered, and SABR's research is pretty much accepting of this, is that he is personally responsible for the rule that the American Association passed, which awarded first base to a hit batsman, which before that it was not awarded. If you got hit by a pitch, too bad. Stay there and take your cuts. He was also, unfortunately, not unlike his time, fairly racist. One of his catchers was the first black player to play in a major league association, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who I hope many of you know. He later called Walker one of the best catchers he ever threw to, but he also said that he did not like throwing to, and I'm not going to use the term, people of his like. So when Walker would call a sign, he would just throw whatever he wanted. So you can imagine what that was like for the catcher, especially. Because of him trying to move around, he actually told St. Louis of the American Association that he would join them. And then when Toledo of the Union Association came calling and said, well, we'd give you more money, he signed with them also, not telling them about the St. Louis contract. And then finally, when it looked like Toledo wasn't going to work out, he actually joined Cincinnati in the Union Association. The associations pretty much were fed up with that. And they pretty much said, the American Association, who had the most power, said, okay, you're done. Not only are you suspended for the 1885 season, we're going to charge you a $2,000 fine. He was forced to give back $1,000 that he had received from Cincinnati already when he signed his contract. So the city's resentment against him was pretty palpable. And even though he signed with the Cincinnati Reds to play the 1886 season, there was a bit of tension there. He was also famously hot-tempered, and one incident is pretty entertaining. So there was a close game in Louisville in 1884, and Mullane, who said earlier that he would never really throw left-handed unless it was an exhibition game or it didn't mean anything, it was a close game, and he switched to left hand, and he threw a curveball to a hitter named Chicken Wolf, and he clubbed it over the left field fence. Now, Mullane's reaction was, in his own words, he went to the dressing room and clubbed myself in the shins with a baseball bat repeatedly, for which I was fined $25. You would think that beating yourself in the legs was enough, but the $25 fine probably hurt as well. But there's no question whatsoever that he was an incredibly talented pitcher. He was a bit mercurial. He liked to move around teams. There's no guarantee that if he had stayed with one team, he would have had a better record. But I think in those days, moving about like he did made him seem ungrateful. When people stayed in one job for 30 years, when they stayed with one team for so long. Somebody asked me during the Cooperstown presentation why I use this slide of the cutout of a newspaper article of his stats as opposed to like Baseball Reference or something. It just seems fitting. You're going to see a lot of newspaper accounts moving forward. So it just seemed a little bit better. He came to Cincinnati in 1886. He signed a contract with the Reds, who welcomed him. He actually opened an office on Dayton Street in Cincinnati. He had designs to open a pool hall, and pool halls will come into the discussion later on 3rd Street in Cincinnati. It's time to talk a little bit about the newspaper era of the time. So we're in the era where we have people like William Randolph Hearst. And this is Hearst's New York Journal. Interestingly enough, when John McLean would sell the Cincinnati Enquirer, he sold it to Hearst and then started the Washington Post. Newspapers were fickle. When Mullane was suspended for the 1885 season, newspapers went on a crusade against anything that they thought might sell papers. It really was an era of crusades. It didn't really matter what the crusade was. It just mattered that the paper had taken a position on it. And this is also an era, and if reading back into the history of journalism, the 1880s is the first time when reporters and newspaper owners stopped being anonymous and they started having bylines. John McLean was one. Hearst was certainly one. There's the famous quote about Hearst sending 2 of his correspondents to Cuba to cover what he saw as warlike activities between the Spanish rulers and the Cuban revolutionaries. When his reporters cabled him and said, well, there's no war here. There's nothing to see. He said, he had a now famous line that says, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. And that's when the main incident and everything else like that happens. So we turn to the Cincinnati Enquirer. a well-known paper that had been around since the 1840s. Why would they take on ball players? Why would they take on Tony Mullane especially? They had a weird bent towards distrust of him. There's a quote when he threw a no-hitter that the paper remarked in its game story, quote, "It is true that Mullane's delivery is terribly illegal, but that excuse has been worn out." Not quite what you'd expect from a hometown paper reporting on a hometown no-hitter. So John McLean, who owned the Cincinnati Enquirer, he had his troubles with the Cincinnati Ball Club. And I just want to preface this by saying, I know I'm going to throw up a lot of newspaper articles. I don't expect folks to read them. I'm not going to leave them up for as long as you need to read the whole thing, but more to give you a sense of the first couple sentences or so. So John McLean was a former stockholder, of the Cincinnati Reds. He was forced out in odd circumstances. There were many lawsuits going back and forth. And McLean in particular had a beef with the manager and future newspaper columnist, O.P. Kaler, who was the baseball editor of the Enquirer at some point. So McLean came into the 1886 season not feeling too charitable towards the Reds, to say the least. He actually even helped finance the Union Association entry in Cincinnati that was popularly known as the Cincinnati Outlaw Reds. And the Sporting Life on June 23rd of 1885 did a great story on McLean. And he said, it says, quote, "The Enquirer has for years hounded the Cincinnati club under all of its changes of management under direct orders from the owner of the sheet, McLean, who is an ousted stockholder of the Cincinnati club. He has been back of every scheme to injure the club. He was instrumental in having the club dispossessed of its grounds in 1884. He was behind a scheme last winter to place a league club in Porkopolis, which I wish there was a team in Porkopolis right now. That would just be wonderful. In opposition. So he really had a beef against the Cincinnati Reds. This is not uncommon, right? We can think of Dick Young in the New York Mets in the 1970s. We can think of other examples of newspapermen who really didn't like the team they covered. But this was the owner of a newspaper, which really had it in for the club as well. So let's talk about June 1886. And this is where we get to the fun part. So this is a box score of a game played in Cincinnati between the Brooklyns and the Redlegs. You can hopefully make it out, but I will describe it to you. Cincinnati had a 7-0 lead in the top of the 8th, or until the bottom of the 8th, when Mullane, who pitched the whole game, gave up 12 runs to lose the ball game. Unusual. I mean, who leaves somebody in after giving up 8 runs in the 8th inning? But that was the way baseball was at that time. And again, remember that Mullane was one of the most well-regarded starting pitchers in the game at the moment. He survived his suspension in 1885. Clubs were angling for his services because of his skill. Mullane, with a 7-0 lead, couldn't hold it, gave up 12 runs, and lost the ball game. So this is on June 4th. On June 5th, the Enquirer the next day publishes an article entitled "Tony the Traitor." It doesn't mention this game. It doesn't mention anything on the field. It basically goes back to Mullane being a traitor to the clubs that he signed with. And there's a quote on June 7th, which continues this sort of thing that says, quote, "It is doubtful whether Mullane will pitch any games here. He is not to be trusted. And if he loses a game on home grounds, the hitherto polite and forgiving crowds may well forget themselves." The Times-Star, which was kind of a sister paper of the Enquirer, ran something else the next day, saying that for some unaccountable reason, the Cincinnatis put Mullane in the box today, as if he shouldn't pitch anymore. On June 9th, the Times-Star said the traitorous Tony is suspended. On June 10th, the Times-Star said Tony Mullane not suspended. This is all just kind of a run-up of what the paper was actually trying to do. And this is what came out on June 18th in 1886. Rascality, which is a word that, again, I think we should use more. It's just kind of perfect. How Tony Mullane sold games. The dishonest clique in the Cincinnati Baseball Club. A team betrayed. Reliable tips. And they show the box score, of course. And they said the plainest cases in the game with Brooklyn in the last of the series, and then they referenced the 12-7 game. The Enquirer said that Mullane had sent a message to a gambler saying, after the 6th inning, bet all the money you can get on the Brooklyn club to win. I guess the equivalent today would be saying, like, watch your BetMGM account, and when the odds go crazy, bet everything you can on them to lose. What did the Enquirer have to back up their accusations? Right? Well, this is one they came out with. Mullane let Brooklyn win after the 7th inning. Before that, they'd been playing a splendid game, and the score stood 7-0. Then something phenomenal, almost unprecedented occurred. A little bit ridiculous. But the Enquirer had more, or so they said. And this is from the Baltimore Sun. And it's good to note, or it's important to note, that other papers in baseball playing cities, I've seen papers in Baltimore, Louisville, even cities like Akron, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana, they kind of picked up on this story almost like it was on the AP wire. And they basically reported the story as the story. They didn't say, well, you know, we've thought about this and we have our opinion. But they basically say, in support, and I'll read here, in support of the charges, 2 affidavits are printed. The first from PJ, his name was Patrick McMahon of Indianapolis. And what McMahon said was that on June 3rd, remember that's a day before the Brooklyn game, he got a letter from Mullane, postmarked in Brooklyn, telling him to bet on Brooklyn. Bet as much money as he could. And this article says, bet on them after the 4th, 5th, and 6th innings. What else did the Enquirer have to say about why this was obviously a thrown game? Well, 10 of the dozen runs were earned. Of course, that makes sense. If they were unearned, if they were errors, then that wouldn't have been his fault. I'm showing you this slide just to tell you that this is there's probably about 16 paragraphs like this in the different stories that the Enquirer ran between June 18th and July 1st that try to make an argument why he threw the games, as opposed to saying, we have evidence, we have the letter, we have other testimony from players. They're basically saying that, well, he lost the game, so obviously it must be that he threw it. This is also another piece of evidence, quote unquote, that they said that they gave, that they knew all along that there were members of the club, but they were not doing it. And I have to forgive here, and if those who take offense for the obviously racist influence in this sentence, if there was a Negro in the woodpile, that also gives you an indication about what Cincinnati was like at that time. Cincinnati was a very militant sort of city. They were not happy with a lot of progressive movement. They were certainly not happy with Moses Fleetwood Walker. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the New York Post, but as I did the research for this presentation and for the paper, I kept coming back to the New York Post, where all these sort of agitations were built into each other, right? The Enquirer knew something was coming up. And the nature of journalism at that time was that, papers couldn't afford in St. Louis or Philadelphia to send a reporter to Cincinnati to go interview Mullane, right? They could, if he was there for a game, they could try to talk to him. They could try and do this and that. But basically what other papers did, and this is just 2 of about 20 examples that I have, is that they basically just repeated the allegations. And in none of these, the one that's interesting is the Philadelphia Times down here, where they say Mullane denounces the report as false and even malicious. but the charges are made with such positiveness and detail that the American Association will investigate the matter. In other words, he denies it, but boy, the paper's they're pretty sure of this. So, they've got this affidavit from this guy in Indiana, PJ McMahon. So if you're reading the paper in St. Louis, if you're reading the paper in Philadelphia, in Washington, and New York, you're like, whoa, Tony Mullane's throwing games. Cincinnati Enquirer doubled down. They alluded that Tony Mullane also sent a letter to someone else saying that, hey, I'm not pitching in the Philadelphia game, but they're going to lose in late innings on the 24th of May. Now, remember that this is before the June game where he supposedly threw the game to Brooklyn. And the fact that they lost is given as evidence of the fact that, well, it must be true. They also gave evidence about this, and I've only seen this in secondary sources. I haven't seen it in newspapers, so I'm not quoting it here. But that Mullane also sent a letter postmarked in Louisville that was sent to another gambler in New York, a gambler that owned a pool hall in New York City, saying, hey, bet enough of this that you'll win everything, especially with the odds, same as the Brooklyn game. With the Enquirer, they doubled down. So this is about 5 days after their first allegation. And I love this. I love the self-serving and kind of humble nature of this paragraph. It does no harm to repeat a good thing, and therefore the Enquirer reiterates that it has no enmity towards the Cincinnati Club, the American Association. Its warfare will be against the rogues and scoundrels who have worked themselves into the ranks and who are dragging the national game down to everlasting ruin. Remember what I said earlier about crusades? This was a crusade. And when you're in a crusade, you do what you can, right? So they had a report from Akron, Ohio, that quoted friends that say, well, and he did start his career in the city. While he always paid his bills here and was generally considered on the square, he then already manifested a disposition to be slippery. No one's quoted. No one's cited. There's no evidence. I would love to say that this is kind of only based in the late 19th century, but I think it still happens, right? But it's just peculiar to both the town of Cincinnati, this particular newspaper, and the environment that we're in. But I really want to cite here two things. One is that because of these allegations, the American Association decided they will undertake an investigation, and they did. They called everybody in June 30th. They had the investigation in Cincinnati, even though the Enquirer published an editorial saying it should be in Indianapolis, because that's where all the subterfuge is happening. The association also challenged the Enquirer to come in and give its evidence. If you can see a little bit down the page, we will call a special meeting at Cincinnati and invite the Enquirer to substantiate its charges. Give any evidence. Sure, we'd love to see it. The American Association will push this matter to the end. The public can be assured there will be a thorough investigation. Yet you'll note that the Times Star, again, a sister paper of the Enquirer, said, silly talk from President Byrne. So what exactly is going on here? You've published these allegations, you've published these charges, you've cited affidavits from gamblers, you've talked about specifics, a little bit of specifics about pool halls and so forth, but you've not given any details. So on June 26th, the Enquirer did two things. One is that it attacked the court itself, right? So it published a letter back to Mr. Wyckoff, who was part of the American Association committee. The Enquirer has no warfare to make upon any but dishonest and disreputable methods. And so they are refusing to come and testify. They're refusing to give evidence, which they say only they have. and they're refusing to even show up at the Grand Hotel to talk about this. They also, on June 26th, and I don't have a copy of this in my slides, but they noted that there are some startling revelations, and they introduced two new characters. They say a detective, Henry Huthsing, has been sent to Indianapolis to check out the allegations and to find the gamblers and to bring them to Cincinnati on the 30th. Couldn't find him. Another detective, Charles Page, was rumored to be in Cincinnati, and they were looking for him. He ended up to be in Kansas. Not surprisingly, on June 30th, the American Association held not a trial, but they held a meeting where they invited some folks to come in and say, what is happening here? Anybody who wants to can testify. They called Patrick McMahon, who did show up. And McMahon's testimony was non-convincing, to say the least. When McMahon was in front of the board of the American Association, he said, no. The telegram I got said to bet on Cincinnati, not to bet on Brooklyn. He said, Mullane told me that Cincinnati would win, and he was confident about it. And then when the association officials asked him about that, he said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I forgot. It was on Brooklyn. It was a complete hash. The other gambler, Clayton, who was supposedly the New York gambler about the Philadelphia game, was never found. It's not believed he actually existed. I looked for him in city directories in Cincinnati, New York, and Indianapolis. Better researchers than me, I think, probably can look for him as well. From my cursory reading and from others who have written about this, he was never found. He didn't exist. The pool room in Indianapolis on 4th Street wasn't a pool room. Didn't exist. Had never been a pool room. There's an alleyway in New York where the Enquirer had said an alleged conversation had taken place. That didn't exist either. It's a mess. Mullane's acquitted by the American Association. The Enquirer obviously was not happy about it. The Enquirer convicted by a baseball association as if they're the victim. Making serious charges, not spurious charges. They don't even back down there, but they say serious charges. And then they say Tony Mullane, however, receives a magnificent coating of whitewash. Now, the interesting thing about this, I haven't brought up yet, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the legal details of this. Libel law in America at that point was incredibly forgiving. So what the Enquirer did in the weeks running up to the investigation was to say, we don't want an investigation. We want Mullane to sue us for libel. And again, not getting into the weeds, but since about 1964, you have to prove actual malice. The Sullivan case, some of you might remember, Sullivan v. New York Times. So at that point, if Mullane couldn't convince a jury that the Enquirer had actual malice against him, he might lose a lawsuit. And the Enquirer could say, we were right. So that's why the Enquirer keeps kind of doubling down on this, what they call the fraud investigation and so forth. Mullane is cleared. He announces an intention to file a $20,000 lawsuit. I have it here somewhere about how much it would be in today's money. A lot of money, let's say, probably $750,000. Why did they do it? Why did McLean and the Enquirer go on this crusade with made-up evidence, with real malice, with real self-righteousness, with real crusading? A couple of reasons. One is I think they could, right? The nature of journalism at that point, and we're leading into the 1890s with William Randolph Hearst, is that you wanted to sell papers. People want to sell papers today, but thankfully there has become much more of a journalistic standard. You know, there's these standards ebb and flow. But if we look at the 1880s, it was kind of, you know, with so many dailies, with so many evening papers, with so many tabloids and so many broadsheets. Excuse me. You just could. And Mullane's reputation being what it was, you could kind of be believed a little bit. The other reason why was the enmity between John R. McLean, who I talked about earlier, and the Cincinnati Reds manager, who was a fellow named O.P. Kaler. And the Sporting Life in 1886 did a wonderful piece about, and this is probably the only good piece of investigative journalism I've found, because the Sporting Life went into this and they said, quoting, "This year, this warfare has been intensified by the bitter personal hatred McLean entertains for the manager of the Cincinnati's, O.P. Kaler." Turns out that Kaler had actually been one of the folks that wanted to turn McLean out of the Cincinnati club because he felt he was incompetent. He felt he was rude. And also another interesting note about the Enquirer, as the Sporting Life quotes, and this has been backed up by other sources, "In this war upon the club, McLean has been ably assisted by his managing editor, L.N.O. Myers, who has good cause for hatred, having once been expelled from the grounds for drunken and disorderly conduct. He was thrown out of the Reds' grounds and held a grudge ever since then." And so from this kind of petty animosity grew this campaign against what could be a Hall of Fame player. The Enquirer kind of kept the story alive for a little bit. You know, they brought up something else about the pool rooms, which you can see here. This was on July 16th, 2 weeks after the verdict. They kind of tried for a little bit and then they just kind of let it die. In particular, because Mullane filed a $20,000 libel suit, which I already talked about. Contemporary accounts call it successful. I have not seen an account which backs up whether Mullane actually received the money or not, because I think that would be news, right? The papers at this point, papers all over, especially all over the Midwest, were following this story. So I don't know what successful means. And this is part of the next part of my project, is to figure out exactly what happened with the libel suit. What I have a feeling happened is the Enquirer said, "Yeah, you won. Here's a few bucks. Go away." And I think from Mullane's perspective, the fact that he had won the suit was enough. He just wanted his reputation back. He'd had enough of this nonsense, and that was it. Not that $20,000 wouldn't have made a difference for him, but it would have. So where do we go from here? Mullane, as you might know, had a decent rest of his career. He declined a bit after about 1886. He was still a good pitcher, but not the best that he could have been. He went to Chicago, and in 1903 became a member of the Chicago police force. And he actually worked his way up to detective. He was very well regarded. He pitched a little bit, and actually in 1902, he was an umpire in the Pacific Northwest League until he one day joined the club in Spokane and pitched 20 games and went 3-0, because you could just kind of do that in those days. He left the following year. He served in Chicago police until 1924 at age 65 when he retired. He had some health issues, but he was a very strong, athletic guy. This is an interesting note I found in 1911 where they said he was about to die. They almost printed his obituary. He lived another 33 years. He lived till 1944. He's buried in Alsip, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. And that's kind of his legacy. Not inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was inducted into the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame in 2010. A good life, right? I don't want to, and I want to make some conclusions here. One is that I don't want to overplay the fact that this incident really changed his life I think it changed it in a pretty significant way. But it's not like the Pete Rose situation. It's not like here was this beloved athlete. Suddenly the scandal happened. And again, with Rose, we all have our opinions. In mine, he at the very least committed these crimes. Mullane did not. I think the scandal has cost him a lot, though. I think when you combine that with his sense of his perceived sense of disloyalty, his perceived sense of being his own person. I just recently, and this is going to be a reach, I just recently finished a wonderful biography by Mike Nathanson about Dick Allen, right? Maybe, you know, obviously leaving out the racial aspect, Mullane was a sort of Dick Allen of his day. You know, I'm not happy with the Phillies. I want to go to the Cardinals. I'm not happy with the Cardinals. I'll go to the Dodgers. I'm not happy with the Dodgers. I'll go to the White Sox. That was Mullane in the 1880s, where this was completely unheard of. So I think when you add it all up, yeah, I think it really hurts the legacy. Turning to another part, which again is not baseball related, but if I can just give it a couple of sentences. One is that this really illustrates what yellow journalism was about. It was about sensationalism. It was about crusades. It was about tabloidism, which still exists today, except it's kind of moved over into cable news, right? So it's really fascinating to me about this incident that it really took hold. And I think the thing that resonates with me is that it didn't only just take hold in Cincinnati, it took hold in St. Louis, it took hold in Fort Wayne, it took look in, you know, people read their daily papers and they said, have you heard about Tony Mullane? It was like, oh yeah, here's a cheat, you know, here's a this and that, right? So I think we should give a thought to Tony Mullane. Not a good person. I don't mean to say that he's, you know, suddenly a wonderful saint. The way he treated Walker was terrible. The way he treated his teammates sometimes was terrible. You know, signing contracts when you already had a contract is not good. But give a thought to Mullane in the sense of he was really battling against some forces that wanted to take him down. I'm going to end here. I'll just put something up about sources. The Hall of Fame clippings file was amazing. I'm only listing a couple of papers here because I went through, I mean, a ton of newspapers, which is a lot of fun. SABR's profile. If you're not a fan of, or if you want to learn more about 19th century baseball, there are two books in particular. Dewey and Acacella's book about Hal Chase, the Black Prince of Baseball. It talks a lot about the gambling influence that came up in the 1880s. And then Edward Acheron's book, which I'm sure a lot of us have read, The Summer of Beer and Whiskey, which is just a terrific book. So I am going to stop share here. I think I went a lot longer than I intended, but I hope it was fun, and would love to hear any questions.
I'm blown away by the entire thing, but you know, every time I have someone who comes in and talks about 19th century baseball, I say the same things every time. I love the language of the baseball writer in the 19th century because it's just so flowy and over the top. It's almost like watching Jim Ross on WWE when he was still doing commentary. Dan Mason in the chat. Rascality for the win, though. Yes, it's a beautiful word. I just called up Tony Mullane on Baseball Reference. And his counting stats, he was 284 and 220 with a 3.05 ERA over his career. He was worth 61 wins above replacement, according to Baseball Reference. I would be interested to hear from Dixie Tarango, who knows far more about 19th century baseball than I could ever dream to. Dixie, what do you think of Malone as a Hall of Famer? Do you think he is one who should be considered?
I think he should be considered, considering his win total and his percentage total and all that good stuff. I was just wondering why I didn't see a presentation in Cooperstown, because I gave one the day before about two pitchers from 1886. And the reason I didn't see yours is because my friend Herm Krabenhoff was speaking at exactly the same time you were.
Right. Yeah.
Is the problem with the 19th century conference on occasion that you want to go to two things at once and you can't do that.
And I missed yours because I only arrived in Cooperstown the day before. So I got there the night before mine on Saturday. So, yeah.
So Craig knows what to do right now. If you have a question for our presenter, Doug Krehbel, this evening, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. You will see another button marked raise hand. Raise your hand and we'll get you in line to ask questions of our presenter this evening, Craig Gerritsen. You're up. Go.
Do you think great presentation. Do you think his comments about Moses Fleetwood Walker would basically make him ineligible at this point for the Hall of Fame? I mean, everything I've seen about Mullane talks about Moses Fleetwood Walker.
Yeah, it's that's a double-edged sword, right? I yes and no. As a card-carrying liberal, yes, because you can't have that attitude. But again, not trusting the journalism of the day, right? So the quote I gave about he was a Negro and I didn't like pitching to him, that's a secondary quote that comes actually from the 1883 book. I don't know where that quote comes from, right? And he later called Walker the best catcher I ever threw to. I have a hard time answering your question, to be honest, sir, and it's a great one because people are kept out of the Hall for a lot of reasons. Again, I just think it makes him a complicated character. It makes him a character of his time. It's not forgiving that sort of attitude. But there are avowed racists in the Hall of Fame,
yeah.
Right? And so I'm going to answer your question by not answering it, if you don't mind.
Doug will be running for office in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Ben Abel, you're up. Ben, go. How you doing?
Doug, nice to meet you. Fantastic presentation. I dropped a couple questions in the chat, just saying the way you tell that story about 19th century intrigue of baseball is, and I put the 19th century equivalent of the trash can. Fantastic, because SABR really opened my eyes to how different an event happens in history when it's told the way you tell it versus watching something like 8 Men Out and then reading Jacob Pomeranke's thing about 8 Men Out, right? And how, I mean, we all know this with anything, right? Stuff like that is always fictionalized and stuff is always added or subtracted. And I really like to hear stories like this when it's as accurate and as, I don't want to say dry, but it's as factual as can be.
Yeah, thanks, Bennett. I do want to add one thing that this was interesting. My partner, when I was prepping the presentation for Cooperstown, she was saying, well, what are you putting on the slides? And I said, well, it's newspaper articles. And she was like, well, your whole point is about distrusting newspapers, but you're putting newspaper accounts on the slides, right? So I think that's part of the what we have to deal with in 19th century baseball, because I mean, every book I've read about it, quotes newspaper articles, right? You can't quote, there's no radio interviews. There's no TV interviews with players, right? There's no autobiographies written by, no social media.
No social media, yeah.
I mean, social media would be the biggest one to me, right?
Yeah. I mean, Twitter was basically carving your initials on a tree, but so, but it's so fascinating that these athletes also, the one thing that strikes me and the powerlessness of the athletes, right? The athletes couldn't go to reporters and say, hey, this is my story, tell this part, like Dick Allen did. I've got it on my brain since I just finished the book. They couldn't just call up the Cincinnati Enquirer news desk and say, like, hey, I'm Tony Mullane, this is nonsense. So, it's both fun and disturbing to read a lot of the newspaper accounts without any sort of balance from the individuals involved. So I'll get off my soapbox with that one.
Well, I always
Nixie Tarango. Whoops, sorry, Ben.
I always think of, for those who would get this reference, the movie The Natural, and I love Robert Duvall's character.
Yeah.
He plays that shady, sleazy reporter. I can't remember his name in the movie, but fantastic portrayal of a journalist, right? Or like a sort of a shady kind of, right?
Or
that kind of thing.
And, from Inherit the Wind, the reporter who shows up there and is just, like,
I don't know Inherit the Wind, but I know.
Sorry, it's a great play about the Scopes monkey trial.
Okay.
And there's a reporter that shows up from the big city, and he's like, "I just want to hear this. I just want to hear what's sensational." So yeah, you're absolutely right, Ben.
Duvall was Max Mercy in The Natural. Yeah. Let's go to Dixie. Dixie, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing fine. I think your use of the newspapers is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm in the 19th century all the time. That's all we have. There's no radio broadcasts or anything like that. So you have to depend on what you can read, and that's what we can read. The more newspapers, the better, but still you have to depend on them. I noticed that one game on June 4th, the Cincinnati paper had the box score completely screwed up because they had more runs for Cincinnati than they actually scored in the box score. Yeah. So you can start right there with what a fiasco it all was.
I mean, David Nemec's encyclopedia of 19th century baseball, like he says at the very beginning, he's like, look, this is what we've got.
That's right. And also determining what people were supposed to feel like then, or what they were supposed to think then. Sure. You can't do that. It's 1886. It is not 1986. So you have to consider that all the time.
Yeah. And again, for those of you who want to learn more about this, that the Summer of Beer and Whiskey is it's about the 1883 season, which was a great season, but it's so well written. It's one of my top 5 baseball books.
You mean this?
Yes. Oh, no, wait. Which one?
That's it.
Yeah. It's fabulous. So
the best baseball book I have in my collection, over 1,000. The best.
I'd vote well, okay, we won't get into that. We'll be here all day. But I like Brosnan's book, The Long Season. But.
I just finished that one a little while ago.
Yeah, so good.
Thomas Harkins, you are up. How you doing, Thomas? You are muted. Could you unmute down on the bottom of the screen, please?
Yes. First of all, Tony Randall played the reporter in the Broadway play of Inherit the Wind.
He did.
And Gene Kelly played it in the movie.
Yep.
And speaking of that box score from the
We need to be friends.
Cincinnati game, right? The winning pitcher was John Pa Hawkins. No relation, but the only other Hawkins that ever played Major League Baseball. It's the only Hawkins that played Major League. So I love seeing that. Never saw his name in a box score before.
I'll share it just so you can see it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he hit 8th, so that's all right.
Yeah.
Tony La Russa would have been proud. Good stuff.
Well, I think Gary Peters pinch hit a Aparicio one time. A Hall of Famer.
Good stuff, Doug. This has been fantastic. What a great presentation. Thank you so much.
You're very kind.
Oh
Thank
my
you.
gosh, so cool.
You guys are a great.
All right, we're gonna be back Monday, May 26th with John Miller and his new book, The Last Manager: How Earl Weaver Tricked, Tormented, and Reinvented Baseball. The link to sign up is in the SABR events calendar and the chapter meeting booklet distributed each week with the Monday Message newsletter. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you are not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world, just like Doug Krehbel. For more information, go to SABR.org today. Doug Krehbel, you're fantastic. Thank you very much for doing this. We appreciate you. Let's get everybody out of here. Let's go watch some baseball, huh? Have a good night. We'll see you next week, everyone.